Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. Today is September 25th, 2025. It is Thursday evening, and this is episode 141 of the PetroNerds podcast. So, as I always say, I'm going to try to keep this intro short and sweet, but it is difficult to do that because there's so much happening in the market right now. So, we're going to get you completely up to speed because this is a podcast that I'm glad if you're listening, but this is definitely one you might want to watch on YouTube. I'm sporting this awesome new PetroNerds shirt that my sister helped me make with her Cricut. And so we have like PetroNerds sparklies. So it's really, really cool. And this episode is filmed in a really, really cool studio that Jason, Isaac, and I did in Washington, D.C. earlier this month. So I'm going to give you up to speed on what this episode is about, which is about power generation in China. And it's just a really cool 40-minute episode that Jason, Isaac, and I, the president of the American Energy Institute, and myself did in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. But I have been doing a lot of traveling. So it is September 25th, 2025. We're looking at 65.28 for WTI right now. So there's a lot to unpack and a lot going on under the hood with oil prices that I am just extremely disappointed in the stock market coverage and oil market coverage and analysis. Like, I just pulled up a CNBC article. It's crap. I mean, of telling you actually what's driving oil prices right now, it's absolutely terrible. But with that being said, we'll get you up to speed on what is actually happening because a lot of it has to do with a lot of it has to do with what's going on within Ukraine, what's going on within the Middle East. But in the past few weeks, I have been doing a lot of traveling. My folks were here this week for a doctor's appointment, so I was here in Denver this week. But last week I was in Dallas, or sorry, excuse me, not Dallas. Last week I was in Fort Worth for another Whitley Penn conference where I keynoted and addressed, which just was awesome. Went off without an absolute hitch. And I, right after I did the keynote, I went over to the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce and I gave a talk with them. That was a dense slide presentation, super fun, really, really great crowd. And I want to tell you about some of the themes that emerged in within Fort Worth, and especially when I've been in Texas as of late. So I was in Fort Worth last week. The week prior to that, I was in Bismarck, North Dakota, and in Houston. So I had three awesome CEOs on an incredible panel, which will be dropping as a podcast soon. And that was with the Houston Producers Forum, and that was Andrew Navanti, the CEO of Calpine, which is the largest natural gas supplier for natural gas for power. Sheldon Burleson, the CEO of Rockcliffe Energy, and Ron Gusick has been on the podcast recently, the CEO of Liberty. So really, really good conversation. And I know I've talked about this, but there were some themes and things highlighted in that I've really had reiterated and reinforced in my the next legs of travel that I had, especially in Fort Worth. So was in Houston and Bismarck the week prior, and then this recording, which you're going to hear, is from September 3rd. And that was when I was in Washington, D.C. And Jason, Isaac, and myself were both there. We had several different meetings. Then we met up to do this recording. So this is really timely because what we talk about this and record in this awesome studio recorded podcast is we talk about, what was actually happening then, which was these fighter jet flyovers, which were taking place in DC the morning I was there, because Trump was hosting the leader. Trump was hosting the leader of Poland, but that was also when Xi Jinping was having his military parade. So that we talk about that. We talk a lot about China. We talk about the U.S. competition with China. We talk about power generation. We talk about the rising and escalating prices in electricity, and we just talk about really understanding the direct competition with China and how we're competing with China when it comes to energy. And Jason also talks about a lot of this. We get into this China influence within energy, and I think it's really important to appreciate that role of Chinese influence that's across the board. If you think it's nefarious or can hurt the US, China's definitely involved with that. So there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood with that. So we cover all of that. We talk about Intel. We talk about the, kind of the sovereign wealth stuff that's going on within the US and the US government's purchase of going into MP Minerals and Intel, which I do not think is nearly as a bad thing as a lot of people are making this out to be. And we talk a lot about just Trump policies and what's happening within energy, within Department of Energy, within EPA, and what's going on with Chris Wright and Lee Zeldin. Lots of stuff there. So you are very much going to enjoy this 40-minute podcast. You're going to enjoy watching it as well and listening to it. So, but with that, just to recap from everything happening, these big themes that I took away, and particularly from Fort Worth, I spent a lot of time talking to folks. We had dinner. I was really have to give a huge thank you to Ryan Haggerty, who actually invited me to come speak at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, which was just a really, really great group. The message was really well received, which was an hour-long deep dive talk on the state of the market, on economics, on energy, on the macro of all the stuff that I do in a very, very deep fashion. And I was really, really appreciated, I really appreciated the feedback and the reception, but also that a lot of folks are not completely aware of all these things happening. And so this is really timely because Trump just spoke at the UN. And, there's a lot of things. I mean, I call a spade a spade. And I love that the Trump administration is doing a lot on energy. And I particularly love that sometimes Trump, I talk a little bit like this where I'm just very blunt. And when Trump is speaking at the UN, I mean, there's no worse offender than the UN when it comes to climate, when it comes to letting China in, when it comes to letting China have undue influence on the climate agenda globally. And Trump just calls the UN out, especially on the green agenda, but he also calls out all these countries for their immigration policies and what's happening to them for their crime. And he calls them out on saying about NATO spending. And he also had a meeting just after with Zelensky, and we're going to talk about Ukraine in a little bit because that's what's really supporting and driving up oil prices right now, and the abysmal coverage that we're just seeing on that. But Trump gives this what I think is a really, really good address. And actually, he goes to the UN and he goes up the elevator, and the elevator gets stuck with him and Melania in it. And then he goes up to speak at the UN, and the teleprompter's not working. So within this whole talk, you hear about him talking about how he actually had bid on doing the renovations, on actually doing the UN building, and how he didn't get the bid, and how he later testified to Congress about the overspend that they had massive corruption. And so I thought that was just interesting and intelligent, but also then he talks at length about energy within the UN and what's going on, the fact that what's happening in the US with energy. And he talks about the Green New Scam and just basically that renewables are not renewable. So I'm going to read that to you and quote that. But that's really important. And I think that's important because we talk about that in this context of this conversation with Jason. But when I was in Fort Worth and I was spending a lot of time talking to folks, you hear this a lot. And I heard this on Bloomberg just today when I was recapping and listening to Bloomberg surveillance today, is that I heard folks talking about, what's going on with the UN and people talking about green and climate. And they were essentially saying, okay, even though the Trump administration doesn't like it, we're still moving forward with it and we're still doing this. And they mentioned Texas specifically, that Texas is building out a lot of wind and solar. And I really have a problem with this. And that is because that these power purchase agreements that states, including Colorado, has, where folks are allowed to come in with these power purchase agreements, and wind and solar are the cheapest thing. But once they get into the grid, the electricity price just skyrocket. I mean, my electricity prices are roughly, my utility bills are around $200 a month for a 1,400 square foot house in Denver. I never even saw anything close to 100. I would have to see that in the worst days of winter when I'm just revving up my fireplace and I've got my heater going. And I've had to replace my furnace and everything. So it's supposed to be significantly better. And now I'm paying $200 a month roughly on average all the time, no matter what, whether I use it, whether I don't use it, that's what I'm paying, because that's what Excel has jacked up the rates for natural gas and the rates for utilities so much. And so we're seeing these massive escalating prices, particularly in places where you've seen a lot of wind and solar. And so when we talk about this, and when I have these conversations with folks, when I'm very candid at dinner and saying, no, I'm not a fan of wind and solar. I'm not a fan of putting things that go into your grid and drive up the cost of energy and also reduce the reliability, but importantly, the affordability as well. People need access to energy all the time. You can't have just electricity a few hours a day or 20 hours a day and not 4, because that means your refrigerator doesn't work and you can't cool your food. That is what a developing nation looks like, where people they don't have electricity all the time, so they can't work all the time, they can't have it reliability, and they can't heat and cool their food. And so I just think it's, Trump talks about this within his UN speech. Chris Wright is in the audience. We spent a lot of time talking about the policies of the Trump administration in this podcast, but super, super important. So deeply passionate about that. And this is just a theme I picked up when I've been in my travels in Texas, is that I don't think the folks in Texas quite appreciate, just because you have all this natural gas and you have power generation, doesn't mean that the wind and solar you're adding into your state is not detrimental, and it will come back to bite you. So I do not think it's a positive. I think it's really bad that we're buying wind turbines, onshore wind turbines from the province of Xinjiang, which comes from forced labor. I don't care that it's made with coal-fired power generation. I care that it's made with forced labor a hell of a lot more than I care about CO2 emissions. And if you're looking at the CO2 emissions, they're just on a downward steady trajectory for the US and then an upward steady trajectory for China. So that's my note there. But there were other big things, and that is that, right now we're looking at WTI at 65.28 right now. We're looking at Brent at 69.62. We're looking at natural gas at $2.92. There's so much hype and so much euphoria and so much excitement around natural gas. And, that is something, within the talk that we had at the Houston Producers Forum, I, I think people have gotten a little bit over their skis in terms of the power generation side. Not that we're not going to need a lot of power for AI, but that the actual drivers, what you're seeing from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, they actually came out with a short-term energy outlook, and they are showing that, hey, we're going to have a drop in oil prices next year, which, that's all kind of wishy-washy. And then we're going to have a spike in natural gas prices. And so I'm really concerned that the oil and gas industry is not getting ahead of this, because they're super excited about the spike in natural gas prices, but now we're looking at $2.92 an MCF. We're looking at $11.12 for Dutch TTF. That's European natural gas prices in MCF. Um, we'll talk about the 10-year yield in just a moment in the Fed. But that means that, if we see the spike in natural gas prices, the delta between what the ratepayer is paying from Excel or any utility player prices are $18 to $23 an MCF, when actual natural gas prices are $3. That is ridiculous. It's highway robbery, and it needs to be stopped, and it needs to be addressed and dealt with. And so electricity prices have got to get under control, because that is how you industrialize and revitalize your defense industrial base. That's how you just maintain businesses. That's how you become competitive. That's how you make homeowners like myself being able to turn my lights on and be able to afford it, especially small businesses. So there's a lot going on with under the hood there. And I think it's really important that what I'm seeing is that all this excitement on natural gas futures prices, we're seeing $65 for WTI. Lots of talk I had within Fort Worth with folks within the industry, with folks in Houston, of, people not being really excited about oil prices. We are seeing the rig count tick up. We are seeing the frac free count tick up. So a couple of weeks ago, we had a plateau sort of in the rig count, and that we saw that. You could see it in the numbers, and then we start seeing it tick up. And something that Ron Gusick mentioned within the Houston Producers Forum was that, the U.S. is not ceding market share to other producers. And I think that's really important. And you're going to hear that in this talk, is that, we're producing 13.6 million barrels a day, and it's super, super important to hold on to that. But it also means that there's, now that we're $65 a barrel, nobody's really talking about this. What the hell is driving this move from 61 to 65? Well, a lot of what's driving that is, and in the natural gas side, the lowering of prices that we're seeing when we drop down to 2, a lot of that's supply. We are producing a lot of natural gas. And when you start notching up above $3 an MCF, you really send these price signals to these guys to produce. We're very good at producing this. We frack it. It's easy to produce. It's a smaller molecule. These are monster wells that are coming on in the Haynesville, 30, 40,000 MCF a day. They're just ginormous. So yes, they're hard to produce, they're expensive, but just absolutely incredible. And I heard this, I know I probably mentioned this in previous podcasts, but I heard this again when I was in Fort Worth. So just really important to reiterate that, is that pressure on natural gas prices, that's being driven by storage levels, that's being driven by weather. If you have unseasonably warm weather, in the fall or winter, and storage levels, and then it gets also be driven by just actually lots of production. And then we have to maintain those LNG exports. And so what's happening is, what the EIA is saying, we're going to have this spike in natural gas prices, and that's going to be driven by LNG exports, but not power demand. And they're calling for more wind and solar into the power generation pool, which really irks me and pisses me off, because that it means that your electricity prices are going up. No one's going to benefit from these low natural gas prices, and that you have to be banking on a bunch of ships coming online to where we can actually move these with vessels, move these with the LNG exports. And it's not that we don't have global demand. We absolutely have global demand. I'm seeing articles on LinkedIn where people are saying we're going to have a glut of LNG, and we're going to have problems with natural gas. We're not running out of natural gas. We have more than enough in the US. We could double production if it wasn't for infrastructure constraints. We can supply the world, probably multiple times over with our natural gas, but you have to build the infrastructure. And it's not as simple as just burning this coal rock here. And you have to actually transport it and compress it, turn it into liquid, turn it back into a gas. There's a lot that goes on with natural gas. It is great, but the ships have to be built. So that's on natural gas. So I think we have that. You need to put a pin on thinking about where we're thinking natural gas is going. And you're going to hear that a lot in future podcasts when I sit down and talk about this. So, but WTI and Brent, we're seeing Brent kissing $70 a barrel. And so what's going on under the hood for WTI is that these moves you've seen in days where, if you open up your news and you're looking at it on a Sunday evening, like I do when I'm watching the market, we saw $61 a barrel the other night. And then what happens is they catch wind of what's actually happening, and this is ongoing. So nothing's changed with what Ukraine and what Russia are doing. In fact, it's the rhetoric has been amped up. Dmitry Medvedev keeps talking about nuclear stuff. He keeps threatening the US. And Trump has been talking about the UN, and he's pretty well fed up with Putin. He had a meeting with Zelensky. Now, Zelensky, and he congratulated Zelensky on the pushback that he's giving Putin. But what's driving oil prices really is that, you know, actually an understanding of supply and demand, but more to the point is that Ukraine is attacking Russian infrastructure. So they're using their drones and their strikes, and they're hitting Russian refineries, and so they are having output like outages there. So in a couple weeks ago, they hit their 400,000 barrel a day refinery, and they've continued to strike refineries and oil facilities, and other infrastructure. So that's what's driving that. Largely, that's what's driving that $65 up. But honestly, this is poor trading. This is traders not understanding oil, not trading it appropriately, a lot of pessimism, a lot of downside, press the sell button, and a lot of gut and algorithmic trading, and not a lot of like what's actually happening with oil, because we shouldn't be seeing the swings, because oil prices should really be closer to $70 a barrel, because that's where supply and demand, and that's really where the geopolitical risk premium at the very least should probably have crude oil right now, is much closer to 70. But that being said, we're 65 and change, and that is being driven by the headlines that you are seeing: Ukrainian attacks on Russian infrastructure and Russian refineries. So the Kiev Independent, that's the news source. The Kiev Independent, their headline says, "quote Ukraine hits oil facilities, drone production site in Russia. General staff confirmed." So that's the other big thing, is that they're trying to attack their drone infrastructure, which is a good move, because the drones are what are they're just sending hundreds of drones and missiles into Ukraine to overwhelm their air defense space. So I'm just going to read this quote. Ukraine carried out strikes on multiple targets in Russia linked to oil refining and drone production. Ukraine's general staff confirmed on September 24th. So today is September 25th. So that's the last couple days. On the 23rd and 24th, you've been seeing these strikes. The confirmation follows a reported overnight attack on Gazprom, the Neftenim Slavat petrochemical plant in Russia's Republic of Bashkortostan, which I'm botching the pronunciation of this, so I apologize. The general staff said that the strike hit an oil refining facility in the Republic, specifically the ELOUAVT-6 oil refinery unit. They've hit multiple refinery units. One of them a couple weeks ago was the 400,000 barrels per day. So if you continue to hit these and you hit the power infrastructure, essentially it just downs these for a little bit. And so Russia, as we all know, is exporting a crap ton of crude oil and refined product. And so China and India, which Trump mentions again in his UN address, is there of their purchase of Russian crude. If they can slow this down, and he also mentions actually the purchase of the European Union and NATO nations purchasing Russian crude. And it's amazing, because he just calls them out and he says, it's in your doorstep. It's your war is happening right here. We have an ocean between us, and you're still buying their crude. You are funding the war on yourselves. And that is really sad. And we heard this actually between Trump and Zelensky, where they talked about this directly with Hungary and Turkey, where, trying to get them on board to stop buying this crude oil. And Hungary and Turkey are kind of close with Russia, and they're kind of close with China. So that's a bit of a problem. But anyways, the point is that they've had these attacks. Oil prices have not proper or prices in very well. We also had a GDP revision, a GDP in the US up. And so you see the market kind of selling off, the stock market kind of selling off, because anytime you get this positive momentum on, say, on GDP revisions, that actually should be somewhat supportive of oil prices. But then you get the Fed rate cut bets pull off. And so then the market sells off a little bit. So the stock market's all over the place. AI is absolutely driving it. There's a lot of stuff that is positive under the hood. There's a lot of stuff that's negative under the hood. Quite messy. But the Fed rate cut, the Fed, lowered interest rates last week by 25 basis points. And then you've had just a completely mixed bag, where actually we're seeing the 10-year yield has moved up, not down. This has moved up to 4.177. It was closer to 4.4%. And you're seeing the 30-year mortgage, you can see as low as in the five handles, but the average mortgage across the US from bank rate for this past week has been 6.27%. So still pretty high. But okay, so that's all the stuff that's sort of going on under the hood with oil prices. But I really can't underscore this oscillation and this volatility in trading on the 61 to 65 and the speed at which this is happening. I talk about those $5 swings a lot in oil prices, and that, those are traders, those are not anything else. But really, we sort of actually see, and I don't want to say it's super healthy, but the fact that we don't go below 61 is interesting. And the fact that we have seen five handles earlier in this year. But when I hear people talk about 40s, it drives me nuts. There's nothing out there in the market to support a 40 handle on oil prices. There's really nothing to support 50 handles unless you had a severe recession. And we just don't see that in the cards. Now it can happen, right? There are things that could drive that, right? But that's not what's playing out. And so supply and demand outside of major job layoffs, you're not close to anywhere in the 50s. And so even with that, then you would be refilling the SPR significantly, or you should be. So what is interesting though, and so if you look at the CNBC article and you just pull it up, you can see that it's quote, oil eases as investors reassess Fed rate cut expectations. And the ease is that it was just moving up above 65 and it's pulled back somewhat. But what's happened is that, so they do put in this article, they put, quote, the return of, it's a quote of a quote, the return of Curtis supplies adds back fears of oversupply narrative, propelling a pullback in prices. So this is kind of ridiculous. So Curtis supply, we are now re-exporting or exporting from Curtis Supply. There's been question marks on Curtis Supply, on Iraqi Supply. And so now they've got this solved, and they can actually export this Curtis Supply. A lot of the crude that we're getting from Iraq, and we're importing a lot from Iraq, there's question marks of whether that is actually Iranian crude. There are a lot of problems in transparency in the crude oil market right now. And I do think that is partly one of the things, in addition to potentially weak demand or potentially questions on demand, Chinese stockpiling, a lot of opaqueness on the demand side, and lots of supply in the market, tons of crude oil from the US, and increases from OPEC, and maintenance of production, all that sort of there as well. But when you have this, and you have, like, when we know we're probably getting Iranian crude into Iraq and then we're getting it to US, these are putting question marks on supply and demand as well, and creating more opaqueness in the market. So it also talks about oil flows from, oil flows resuming. So this is weighing and putting fears on the market. I think this is a little bit overblown, but everybody, if your fingers on the sell button, or your algorithmic trading, or your fear selling, or you're driving it's gut trading that's driving this, absolutely that could sell, and then you could start being worrying about oversupply. I keep saying there's not a lot of conviction in this market. There's not a lot of conviction by anyone, and that is because we're having such poor coverage and such poor analysis of the energy industry and of oil and gas in particular. And then I just want to add that they did put in here that there is some support, because they're saying that, but however, there is some support, and that's because Russia's talking about reducing or cutting their diesel exports because of what's going on the refinery side. So there's a lot at play here. But I want to close this introduction before getting into this awesome podcast. I want to close this introduction by just saying a few things of what the Institute for Study of War is talking about, what is happening on the Russian side in Ukraine, and then leaving you with some awesome quotes from Trump, from the UN, directly with regards to energy. So the Institute for Study of War, their latest update, they talk about, quote, the Kremlin using nuclear threats to influence U.S. President Donald Trump to stop his efforts to secure peace in Ukraine. Now, we're seeing that sort of Dmitry Medvedev. I had mentioned to you weeks ago that he talked about this and sort of threatened this, and then Trump basically pushed back on this. And that's what you sort of see a little bit in the oil market too, is that I think the market priced in a peace deal with Ukraine when Trump and Putin met in Alaska. That was shouldn't have been priced in. That was downplayed by the White House and has continued to be downplayed. He didn't say they were getting a deal. They were just having a conversation. And so the market priced all that in. All right. That was incorrect. And now what you have is this, you have a lot of talk about this deterioration in the economy within Russia. And so you're hearing Zelensky talk about this. You're hearing Trump talk about this. And so there's a moment right now where there's an opportunity that could be sought, where you actually really do reduce the crude purchases from Russia, and you really hurt their economy. And there's been a little oscillation from the White House and Trump on, do we stop purchasing and we risk having a little higher prices and we hurt Russia, or do we actually lower prices? What you need to do is okay, we're going to escalate prices for a little bit, but we're going to really hurt Russia and we're going to pull that back. They've got to rein this in. And so sanctions have done jack. They haven't done anything. And so we've got to solve for this. And so this says, quote, Russia launched a multi-pronged informational campaign intended to mask Russia's economic weakness that U.S. President Donald Trump recently correctly identified. And so that's the fact that they put this out and say that he correctly identified that is kudos to them. Kremlin officials responded on September 24th directly and indirectly to Trump's September 23rd statement outlining Russia's military shortcomings and economic turmoil. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov responded to Trump's statement about how Russia's poor economic situation makes Russia look like, quote, a paper tiger, claiming that Russia is, quote, more closely associated with a bear, and that there is, quote, no paper bears. So that's funny in some way. Peskov also explicitly rejected Trump's assertion that Ukraine could retake territory and assistance from NATO and the European Union. So what my point I'm making with all this is that if you're not following this closely, you're not going to understand these moves in oil prices and understand what's going on there. The drone and missile strikes that Russia is doing to Ukraine are really significant, and the responding drone strikes that Ukraine is doing on Russian energy infrastructure is smart and it is significant. And I think they need to continue to go after and hurt them because one that it's and the oil market needs to recognize that there's some risk to the upside. So just the fact that you have these ongoing wars and this has not been priced appropriately, I've been talking about this for a very long time. Okay, so I'm now going to leave you with the quote, and this just funnels so well into this awesome podcast. Is this the Trump talking about energy at the United Nations when he gave this talk, and he's just absolutely shredding the UN and all the countries in it for saying that they, now they're increasing their NATO spending, but that they really got to get the come to Jesus moment on energy. Quote, energy is another area where the United States is now thriving like never before. We're getting rid of falsely named renewables. By the way, they're a joke. They don't work. They're too expensive. They're not strong enough to fire up plants that you need to make your country great. What he's saying with this is that, and I know people slam this, and I saw a sticker in Denver of ripping on MAGA and Trump supporters, is that making America great. He's talking about infrastructure. He's talking about just turning your lights on, that it's very difficult to do. It's like actually making things. And that's why in competition with China, which you're going to hear within this podcast, you can't do it with wind and solar. You just don't make things with wind and solar. So continuing the quote, the wind doesn't blow. Those big windmills are so pathetic and so bad, so expensive to operate, and they have to be rebuilt all the time, and they start to rust and rot. Most expensive energy ever conceived, and it's actually and it's actually energy. You're supposed to make money with energy, not lose money. You lose money, the governments have to subsidize. End quote for that, just for that moment. Really importantly, this is stuff that he's learning from Chris Wright. This is stuff that he intuitively knows. Chris Wright was in the audience, but he's telling something that no leader in the Western world has been willing to tell people. And he keeps saying it throughout this speech that I'm not being politically correct, and you all are trying to be politically correct, and you're taking your nations into the tank. And particularly one of those is on green energy. So the quote that I was missing up before is that he talks directly about he calls out the UK for their abysmal policies on green energy and much in the fact that they have the North Sea and they actually have lots of oil. So I'm gonna add to this because this is where he gets really tough on Europe here. He says, "quote I love Europe. I love the people of Europe, and I hate seeing it being devastated by energy and immigration. This double-tailed monster destroys everything in its wake, and they cannot let that happen any longer. You're doing it because you want to be nice, you want to be politically correct, and you're destroying your heritage. They must take control strongly and immediately." Of the unmitigated immigration disaster. Okay, he's talking about immigration. The carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intentions, and they're heading down a path of total destruction. The carbon footprint, it was a big thing. A few years ago, I remember hearing about the massive carbon footprint. And then President Obama would get on Air Force One, a massive Boeing 747, and not a new one, an old one, with old engines that spew everything into the atmosphere. He talked about the carbon footprint we must do, dot, dot, dot. Then he'd get back in and he'd fly to Washington, to Hawaii to play a round of golf, and then back to Washington, end quote. So really importantly, he just talks about this. I thought it was a really good mic drop, calling out the Europe and the UN for all their absolute BS that they're doing when it comes to climate, when it comes to destroying their economies. And it's really important because when we talk about the head-to-head challenge with China, which we talk about in this podcast, you have to have energy to produce things. So energy is everything. Full stop. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. This is this awesome PetroNerds t-shirt. My sister helped me make this with her Cricut. There's going to be swag. There's a lot coming down the pipeline with PetroNerds. This is sparkly and really, really cool. But today it is Thursday, September 25th, 2025. This is episode 141 of the PetroNerds podcast. You are listening to Jason Isaac, the president of the American Energy Institute, and myself, Trisha Curtis, the CEO of PetroNerds, but also I am an economist for the American Energy Institute. And this is just a super fun recorded. We recorded this in the 10-minute drill studio outside of Washington, D.C. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Hey, I'm Jason Isaac, founder and CEO and Carbon King of the American Energy Institute. This is a dual episode recording here. I'll publish this on our YouTube channel, The High Carbon Lifestyle, and we'll also publish this as Trisha Curtis, CEO and founder of PetroNerds, CEO and founder of PetroNerds and host of the PetroNerds podcast. Welcome. We are in the 10-minute drill studio today, just outside of Washington, D.C. Had some great meetings. Trisha, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
I'm excited to be on your podcast again. We're doing a lot of work in D.C. trying to drain the swamp.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing the last couple of days here in D.C.
Yeah, so I got here last night. It's been a flat-out sprint. So this is really cool. The studio is awesome. I'm also the economist for the American Energy Institute. So, we're co-hosting this today. So today is September 3rd. Gosh, it's Wednesday. Feels like it's been 2 weeks and 2 days. So it's Wednesday, September 3rd. I was just like one of my first meetings this morning. Trump had fighter jets fly over, 2 sets, not one, 2, which was really cool because he had the Polish prime minister. And so he clearly just wanted to show of strength. I mean, he's happy with the Polish prime minister because they're ponying up the money to actually spend on defense. So we had 2 flyovers and I was on a rooftop, which is just it's the coolest thing ever to.
They're spending money on defense and they're getting energy right in the EU. Like one of the only, are they not?
No, they're better, but at least, when you hear people talking about climate in Poland, I kind of just want to be like, you have other things to worry about. They're just bigger issues. So no, they still produce and consume a lot of coal. I think they definitely have the climate conversation. They're still, obviously they're in Europe, but no, they're definitely spending on defense. They get it. And they have coal and they're using it, and many people don't seem ashamed of it.
Excellent. Well, that's good news. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the EU, though I'm not hopeful. Let's jump right into things. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the Chinese influence that we're seeing, not only, and I know some friends over at State Armor, Michael Lucci published a paper recently talking about the Chinese influence into think tanks, into colleges and universities around the country. Now we're seeing some reports of their influence into groups that are opposing nuclear, that are really opposing Trump's energy dominance agenda. We're seeing groups like the Environmental Law Institute and their Climate Judiciary Project, where they've been out training and tainting judges for the better part of a decade now. Since 2018, they've trained over 2,000 judges on this highly debatable, and some would even argue debunked climate science. That's an issue of concern. I know James Comer and Jim Jordan have just announced investigations into some of these organizations up on the Hill just in the last few days. So I think that's a step in the right direction. But it was interesting, an interview I did on radio earlier this week, someone asked me, why, actually it was Charlie Hurd on Fox and Friends. Charlie Hurd asked me, why would the Chinese be doing this? Why would they be trying to drive the climate alarmist narrative in the United States? And Trisha, I know you've studied China extensively. This is one of your specialties. This is why you're an economist with the American Energy Institute. How would you have answered Charlie on that? Why are the Chinese doing this to America?
Okay, so there's the Chinese influence is pretty broad, right? It's sort of everywhere. The climate arena is one that I'm really glad that you picked up and rolling with is starting to get some attention, is because China has a disproportionate amount of influence within the United Nations. The UN, as you well know, is where a lot of the climate stuff comes from, right? The IPCC report, all this is coming out from the United Nations, and so China has a pretty big influence there. So China has been able to get the UN to deem their Belt and Road Initiative like the Green Belt and Road, which it's not.
This is like the Green Belt and Road Initiative in Brazil, where they're literally doing deforestation for the next conference of parties, the COP that'll be in Brazil. They're literally mowing down large swaths of the forest to build a highway. It's just that kind of level of absurdity.
Yeah, but I mean, you can go from from their influence on climate, and you see it within the UN, their influence on inordinate amount of influence on stuff. Anything that's kind of they see influence and they can be a nefarious actor. I mean, they kind of play in that box. If you look at like, I think it's Clive Hamilton has done tons of work on China's influence in Australia. I mean, like it's across the map. But when it comes to like climate and energy, it's really important to realize and focus on like they have energy, right? They are the largest coal power in the entire world. They're actually the largest electricity power in the entire world. And that's something hugely important, something that actually came up in a lot of my meetings today, is that people are recognizing, and we've talked about this a lot, is that China has a third of the world's power generation. So they have like 10,000 terawatt hours of power generation. Well, that's pretty alarming when now everyone's attuned to like, hey, we need power generation for AI. And so they're realizing, well, crap, China has it. Well, 5,800 of that 10,000 is coal. So, I mean, they're coal-fired power country, 5,800, that is more power than any single country in the entire world has. So they have more coal-fired power generation than any nation on earth has power total.
Incredible.
Which is just like, as you know, reliable, affordable, it's energy secure, has nothing to do with cost for China. I mean, if they had natural gas, that's what they'd use. I mean, it's really about energy security, and it's about like, you know, pumping and dumping and just having the security. So, I mean, there's a number of different reasons that they would have influence in that. But hey, if I'm China and I can get the rest of the world to buy in on climate, and I can get them to buy my solar panels, my wind turbines, and pay for the developing nations in Africa that I'm going to dump them on anyway, if I can get them to pay for it and foot the bill, like, why not? I mean, you know, China's like, they love their win-win. And I was going through a bunch of China books actually over the weekend, and I remember somebody saying in China, win-win means China wins twice.
Absolutely. We're not talking about wind. We're talking about winning, and China is doing it on certain fronts, which is unfortunate. This is something that, you know, just today Shell announced that they're canceling a sustainable aviation fuel company. They're not going forward with investments, probably leaving millions of dollars on the shelf that they're scrapping, citing economics. It's amazing that some of these companies are actually getting back to economics and studying like cost benefit analysis, not virtue signaling. They're learning that virtue signaling is very expensive. You know, this is something I think you taught me with that power generation coming out of China. They're expanding their refining capacity.
Yeah. So it's that's the thing is, and I have to be careful with this because people don't want to hear that obviously China's winning, but I think we have to be very, very honest on the energy front of like, so if you think of like Shell and this aviation business, companies are realizing that we can't, like, talk to an airline company, right? We cannot, there's no easy renewable fuel to put as a substitute for jet fuel, right? We just don't have a substitute. If we did, we'd already be there. Mm-hmm. So there's no substitute that has the same energy density that works. And we flew on planes to get here. Yeah. Like you're just using jet fuel. So it makes sense that these companies have finally, even though they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, but they're finally realizing, hey, this doesn't work. And I backtrack. So loop me back to the question we were on.
We were talking about China and expanding their refining capacity and how they're putting products on the market they previously weren't putting on the market.
Yeah. Okay. So refining capacity. I mean, like they have they just clipped us for refining capacity. We have about 18 million barrels a day of refining capacity, which is like, and we've been the leader in this. We have some of the, you know, and I spent time today explaining to a lot of folks in DC on some of this questions on refining, like how come we produce all this crude but we have to import Canadian crude, and it's because we have these awesome complex refineries on the Gulf Coast that you live in Texas. I mean, they can refine, they have coking capacity, they can refine heavy, you know, thick goopy, you know, crude, and they can get a lot out of it, and so they can get jet fuel and diesel and all this stuff out of it. Well, if I'm China, even if I don't have all this crude oil, I import it. If I have a lot of refining capacity, I'm able to do a lot with that, right? I can use it in my own economy. I can import the crude oil from other countries and I can consume it in my own economy. But I can also have it in a wartime situation. I can also have it in a pinch. I can also stockpile it for sanctions. Like, I'm not warmongering, but there's a lot of reasons you would, if I'm China, that I want a lot of refining capacity. And it's just very fascinating that on paper, they demand, you know, 17 million barrels a day of crude oil. Probably they consume 15 million barrels a day, so they're stockpiling 2 million barrels a day. But the refining capacity, when they have more refining capacity than we do, that's like over prep. That's like over, you know, and that's what they do. They overbuild, but they have more refining capacity than they need. So that means that they could also impact the market on products, right? They could pump and dump, right? They could be, you know, refining cheap Russian crude and then dumping on the market, which is what Trump, Scott Bassett has been saying about India, which China's doing as well, but it also means that they have flexibility in a pinch to have this refining capacity. And you know, we talk about it on oil. I mean, they have it obviously on rare earths, and that's a big problem on the rare earth and mineral side. But on refining capacity, it's just an appreciated aspect of our business is refining, really, really important.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because India is significantly still continuing to buy oil from Russia. You have the EU. My understanding is in 2024, the EU imported more LNG from Russia than it ever has in the past, setting records. So they continue to subsidize the war in Ukraine. This is something that President Trump warned about in front of the UN, which I joked because when you watch the video, you look at the response from the German delegation when he says, Germany is going to become totally dependent on Russia. The German delegation just laughed. And I'm like, man, if you could power Germany on smug, they'd have an unlimited supply. But he's right. The EU is still dependent on Russian natural gas, and India and China are buying their oil as well as Iranian oil.
Yeah, so that's a big and I think the Trump administration is clearly picking a fight with India because they're in the midst of negotiations with China on rare earths. Now, I'm all for the administration being very hard on China. They need to get harder, but there's a number of different things. So just in truth, they're in the midst of negotiations. That's what they're doing. But what they're saying about India is 100% true for China. And so Scott Bessent, he's getting in a little bit of a pickle because he's saying, hey, India is buying all this cheap discounted Russian crude oil, and then they're refining it and then they're selling it on the market. Well, that's who cares about if you're a market guy or not? But China's buying all this cheap discounted Russian crude oil too. And the point is that if you're buying this discounted Russian crude oil, you are funding this war effort, right? Mm-hmm. So sanctions have done jack all. They've just done nothing because Russia's evaded them. Well, interesting enough, last month, India, so apparently Saudi Arabia and Iraq did not export any crude to India. So the month of August, India received they supplemented all of their Saudi crude and their Iraqi crude with Russian crude. So not only did they say, hey, not only were they in China this weekend, we're going to get to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, not only were they in China this weekend with Putin and Kim Jong-un from North Korea, but they took way more Russian crude than they ever have in the month of August. So they basically just said, screw you, Trump, we're in, and now we're going to go hang out with Putin and Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping in China for the weekend. So it was a massive, and I say this no discredit to the administration, but a massive slap in the face to the Trump administration to say, here's where our loyalties lie.
Yeah, I can see that as a finger in the eye for sure. Slap in the face, finger in the eye.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it.
They're basically really disrespectful to President Trump and his administration, and to really the largest economy in the world here in the United States. Not a smart move on their part, in my opinion.
Well, it's kind of case in point of how this negotiations are going, because we've had several rounds of negotiations on the trade side with India. They've kind of all fallen apart, and so India let's be honest, it is a cold river economy. It's a very messy economy, and so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of opportunity, right? But you have to get the opportunity right, and it's messy, right? And they do have a lot of barriers to entry, and so they're not willing to lower their barriers to entry to let our goods come in, and so simplistically, that's what's happening, and so. Narendra Modi is making bets here, and honestly, they call themselves non-aligned, and they're in the non-alignment movement. I think you're pretty well aligned when you're in China and you're hanging out with Putin and you're hanging out with Xi Jinping and you're hanging out with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, and they're all together. And so over the weekend, the pictures were just crazy of Narendra Modi with Putin, and so it's making it clear, hey, we're going to buy their crude. We're getting they're getting a discount on it, and they're getting even more of a discount now. So for China, they're stockpiling, and we need to be more clear about that's a serious thing because they're stockpiling, and so that's an issue, and they're getting it cheap. But for India, they're buying all this crude oil, and they're getting a discount, and now they're making it very clear publicly. And so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that took place over the weekend, this is Kim Jong-un hasn't been anywhere in a long time, and so he takes his bullet train to China, and he was there for the military parade over the weekend, or I think it was on Monday. So they had a big military parade, show of force, and so Kim Jong-un's there, Putin's there, Narendra Modi's there, and they're all hanging out. And I just think it's a clear reality that they're making clear to the world. And I thought that's why it was cool that Trump started today with the two fighter jet flyovers with, the Polish prime minister of hey, we have show of force too, and here it is. And by the way, just a reminder that we dropped those B-2 bombs on Iran. So just out of clarity,
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome. Talking about trade negotiations that are ongoing, the trade negotiations with the EU are ongoing. My understanding is some of the discussions are happening today, this week. One of the biggest things that I've advocated for and talked about is the EU has these practices in place called their CSRD, this Corporate Sustainability Responsibility Directive. There's the CS3D, and then there's this cross-border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially a carbon tax.
Right.
But it's if you sell a product in the EU and you make over like a certain threshold, I think it's like $450,000. It's not very much, but it's basically targeting larger American businesses, requiring them to report their greenhouse gas emissions. Nothing about pollution. It's all about greenhouse gas emissions, and it's essentially forcing American companies that are doing business in the EU to align with the Paris Accords. I think this is treasonous. President Trump has called the Paris Accord a scam. He's pulled the United States out of the Paris Accords, yet you still have American companies that are willing to comply, and they have virtue signaled their commitments to meet them and be net zero by a certain date when you have the EPA working to rescind the endangerment finding. The endangerment finding put in place by the Obama administration in 2009 that says greenhouse gases, namely CO2, are a danger to human health and the environment, which couldn't be further from the truth. And I'm grateful that Administrator Zeldin, the Trump administration, is working to rescind that finding. I think that'll be transformative. But I really believe that these EU negotiations, trade negotiations, should center on those requirements. Stop forcing American businesses to report things that do absolutely nothing. Do you think we're going to have any luck with those negotiations on that front? I know this little policy wonky.
No. I mean, it's relevant, and it's something that people talk about, right? It's definitely something you hear on a lot of folks are aware on that even outside of energy that there's an energy element to it, right? Is that companies are being pressured within the European Union to on very onerous regulations on the climate, on green policy initiatives, which are hurting them, right? And so part of this, people are thinking, is this because the EU is known for having high barriers to entry? So we have a trade deal with them, right? And they're very. The EU is talking about this. They're trumpeting it, like they're excited about this deal, and so they're big fans of this. They're glad we got this big deal done. It's 15% tariffs, I believe. So everybody's like pleased with this. Now it's the devil's in the details and everything. Yeah. So, but it's this stuff that matters in terms of I don't know if it's so much more compliance as that's what the EU does, right? They make it difficult to do business because they love to regulate, and so we have to realize, one, it's about an ease in doing business. So that's problematic. And then it's if you're signing up to onerous regulations, you have to realize, like, what's my exposure? What does it actually matter? And it's not so much about, it's like thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. That's one thing. But in Europe, they don't even count all their numbers, right? If you burn trash, or which they do, or they burn all this stuff, they don't. It's magic math for CO2 emissions. They don't count that in their CO2 emissions.
Or trees, for that matter.
Exactly.
Which they call that renewable.
Right. It's the biomass or whatever. They don't count those. Those are just disappear, and that is part of CO2. But if you look at the actual numbers, I mean, like, look at the numbers, folks, of actual CO2 emissions. EU continues to decline, and it's not because they're doing so great on climate. It's because their economy is crap. Right? They just continue to decline. I mean, we're talking about AI and a race with China, and China having 10,000 terawatt hours of power. Where is Europe? Nowhere to be found, because they're so stuck in the past, and so like they can't get they want to regulate everything to death, and they're not worried about the economy or growing. And so I think it's a really, really important thing, and obviously why I care deeply, and I'm a macroeconomist, is like energy is everything, absolutely everything, full stop. So Europe has not got that right at all. I mean, their exposure to Russia, as you pointed out, was massive. It was 18 billion cubic feet per day when the war happened in Ukraine. 18 billion cubic feet per day was Europe's exposure. 16 BCF a day via pipe, 2 BCF a day via LNG. They've absolutely continued to take LNG from Russia, and that's ridiculous. That's almost treasonous, right? Hello, your fellow man is being invaded, but you're like, hey, I'll still take some of that gas, and they still take the oil, they still take the diesel. Like, come on. Like, we have the LNG. Just get over yourself. Sign some long-term contracts. Let us move this stuff around. Build some damn ships, and let's move forward. So, I mean, this does all come back to energy. And so I think that, a lot of people have been looking forward, and this is why we've talked about this, but I have to drill this home. If the EU, I mean, everybody talks about the European Union and European nations and Germany and all these countries that are spending on their defense, and how, the stock market pivot. Like, we need to, you can divest out of the S&P 500 and the Dow, and you can get into the European stock market because that's where the growth is. Oh, are you kidding me? Like, the size of the entire German, their German stock market that's the size of Apple. Like, Apple's bigger than the entire stock market. So, I mean, that's not diversity. And by the way, if you're going to grow, if you're going to do anything, you have to actually spend money on defense. Well, that's going to require energy. That's going to require actually making ammunition, which will require power generation. And so they have to get that piece in order, and no one's talking about that. And so that's a huge, huge component of not just of like reinvigorating your economy, but your defense industrial base. Like, in order to have a defense, you have to have energy, and that is something that I think China has thought a long and hard about, and they are, that's why they want their coal-fired power generation.
Absolutely, and China's done a great job convincing people in Europe of this climate alarmist movement
and they're very tight with China. Absolutely, the European Union and China are very, very tight.
Yeah. And so they've done a wonderful job. China has been very successful of scaring people in Europe against energy when they're sitting on top of it. They could be producing it. They need to bring in some American companies and produce their own assets, but they don't have private property rights like we do here in the United States. No. We're absolutely blessed with that. There are large reserves there in the EU, but they can't touch them.
They even have the Paris Basin. They'd be just, people would die if they heard that, but they do. It's called the Paris Basin. They do have oil and gas. They just don't extract it.
Yeah, which is just, my grandkids might be looking back at this and laughing because they'll probably be producing oil and gas in Paris maybe in 100 years.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. So no, they could produce it. They don't produce it. I think the ties to China are really significant, and it's important to think about, because if you're just thinking about, our alliances, our natural allies. think about World War II, and it's Britain, and it's and today it's Germany and France, but these nations, they're very, Britain and particularly countries in the EU, they're very, very tight with China because they're exposed so much on trade. And so, it's like fish in a barrel for China, because every time they just pull, they pull the strings a little bit. You had the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the, go over there with a team of delegations. This is, after it's been completely exposed that China is obviously helping fund this war in Ukraine and doing all kinds of, there's all kinds of trade negotiations that they have, trade infringements, the dumping. And the EU has been pretty vocal about this of we put these tariffs on China, and China has went ahead and they're just doubling down on their manufacturing and dumping into the global economy. That helps keep their economy afloat, but also it literally decimates competition everywhere. And so they're not just dumping, they're dumping it hardly into the EU, and everybody's like, oh, wait a second. And it's okay, so it was okay for us to take all their crap with no tariffs, but you don't want it now. Well, hello, this is case in point. And by the way, then they're dumping into all these developing nations as well, which that's quite sad, because it never even gives them the chance to get off the map, and it never gives them a chance to develop a manufacturing base because they're decimated by cheap crap coming from China.
Yeah. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the great work that's happening in the Department of Energy. I know our friend Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy. We actually did an election recap with Chris at Liberty Energy when he was the CEO of Liberty Energy, November 11th, just after the election last year. Grateful for Liberty Energy for being a member of the American Energy Institute and our trade association. Grateful for their support and grateful for the work Chris is doing. Just announced, I think it was this morning, that another offshore wind farm, a massive environmental disaster if you care about our coasts and our oceans and the environment in itself. They've canceled another project. I think this is huge when it comes to affordable and reliable energy production here in the United States. So Chris is doing a great job pulling back billions of dollars in carbon capture, grift, and projects, which I think is just phenomenal. Any other highlights that you're seeing out of the DOE that Chris is doing? There's just so many billions of taxpayer dollars that are being pulled back, not spent, which I think is a good use of taxpayer dollars.
Well, so we had this when we had our podcast with your colleague, Steve Malloy.
Yes.
We did this, the 3-person one, and we did the live stream, and we were talking about this, and it was before the big beautiful bill actually was passed, right? And he was talking about, okay, well, this stuff's in it. Well, he was saying by the stroke of a pen, this stuff's going to be removed, and I was hopeful, but I was very concerned that there was all this stuff still in there. And it does seem like the Trump administration, and particularly Chris Wright and EPA, are just kind of killing it on this front, and they're being very clear and very honest that, hey, wind and solar, when it gets into your grid, it increases electricity prices. And I think that's why we can depoliticize this, folks. This is wind and solar are they're made in China. They are made with forced labor. Onshore wind turbines are largely made in China. They're made with coal. They're made with forced labor. And so they're not. This is not like an ESG friendly product. And so you're putting them into your grid, and they're really cheap. So it's these power purchase agreements, which you and I have talked about at length. But it's so important that everybody has these, and they say, oh, well, it's really cheap. Well, I buy it. Well, it's really cheap because China subsidizes it. Then once you put it into your grid, it gets really expensive. And so the one thing that they're starting out and being really clear about, and hopefully they get clear in other policies, is that wind and solar, once they get into your grid, are really expensive. And so we're going to work on not doing this anymore. And you hear all the stuff of they're ugly and all this stuff, but it's more important than that. It's once you put that wind and solar into your grid, the electricity costs go up. And you hear about the Trump administration talking about wanting lower oil prices. Well, lower electricity electricity prices, they should be equally as clear about saying, and I think that's what they're doing with wind and solar, is that electricity prices on average are over 18 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, in New York, they're way more than that. I mean, cities are so expensive, but that's in comparison to, like, we're on this up and up race for electricity prices. Yeah, that's half of what Germany is, but Germany is like 44 cents a kilowatt hour. It's so damn expensive.
And Germany's deindustrializing right in front of their faces, exactly. And they're driving the policy that's making it happen.
So it's beyond important. And so I always hear, like, a little bit of pushback when people say, but, you know, it's okay to diversify. And I'm like, actually, it's not, because what's happened in America, and you see it in the data from EIA, is that as we've added the wind and solar, we've decommissioned the coal. So we've decommissioned the baseload power generation and we've added this wind and solar. So you've got the worst of both worlds. You got the crappy, intermittent, unreliable, expensive wind and solar, and you took out your baseload power, your reliable, cheap baseload power from coal-fired power generation, and now you have these high electricity bills, and you're killing the American consumer, and you're killing the American business. And so, I mean, I can't say over and over and over again. I was in DC all day talking about this paper that I wrote and the U.S. oil and gas production base, and it's just, we produce 130 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. Like, we should be cheering this from the rooftops, and we should be using it everywhere. Like, this should not be a question, and we shouldn't. It should be very, very hard for wind and solar to get into our grid, because it has to compete with natural gas. And if it has to compete head on, it's not going to win.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be reliable. It's heavily subsidized by China, as you mentioned. It's heavily subsidized by taxpayers here in the United States. Again, no reliability standard. So it's completely intermittent. I think Chris, Secretary Wright, had a great tweet. It may have been from the Department of Energy account, but I think it was his account, calling intermittent energy a parasite on the grid. I was pretty impressed that it's been a couple of months, I think, since he put that out. But just this week, talking about how it's really creates a second grid.
Yes.
You have a grid of wind and solar, and then when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, you've got to fire up your backup grid, which becomes natural gas, coal, and nuclear. And those are very expensive to maintain, run, and build.
And that's the problem, is that people, you have to get nerdy in manufacturing and engineering to think about this, but you have to, like, put yourself in the folks of the people, like, you're running these. Like, you don't just turn this stuff on and off. And so people are like, oh, when it's old, that's great. You have to spool up this massive, combined cycle natural gas facility or coal-fired power generation or nuclear. And so you lose actually all the efficiencies and all the benefits. You don't just get to turn this stuff on and off. We're not playing with dolls here. Like, this is not something you're just like, oh, I turned the toy on and I turned off. That's not how this works. Like, you have to, combined cycle natural gas works so great because you're running all the time. And this is the problem that in the UK they're having, is because, they have natural gas to back it up. And they're like, hey, we have all this wind. Well, they're just killing themselves, and from a cost standpoint, because the natural gas now costs way more because they're not using it efficiently. And so you're actually increasing your CO2 emissions because you're not running that. To decrease them, you have to run that flat out and efficiently. So it's a travesty, and it's so disheartening to see this. And I think this is where, everybody in DC today, I've been getting a lot of questions of, like, well, what needs to be fixed? And I think, we have to be thinking on a state level, though. These power purchase agreements, and realizing that, and what Chris Wright is doing in saying this, that's a parasite. He's also been on the Hill. He's been talking a lot about, like, he basically says really clearly, if it increases cost to the consumer, I'm not for that. And I thought, you know what? That means you are a representative of the American people, and that's pretty awesome.
That was some of the best messaging that I've been trying to harp on for years now, and it's so great from this administration, because he was talking about, someone questioned him pointedly, are you for all of the above energy approach? And he says, not if it makes energy more expensive. And he says, I've never been for all of the above in this administration, and I really tout Chris's leadership on this front. I think he has worked to educate the cabinet and perhaps the president to talk about affordable and reliable energy, and that's what he's for, and that primarily comes from natural gas, coal, and nuclear when it comes to electric generation. He was just talking this week, you could cover the entire world in solar panels and you'd only cover 20% of our energy needs, because you look global energy supply, only 20% of that global energy supply is used for electricity. So obviously energy produces more things that we like and we depend on in this world. It's really sustainable aviation fuel that's made from hydrocarbons. You talk about other aspects. Diesel fuel really powers and moves the earth, but he's doing just a fantastic job on the messaging on that front. And so I'm really grateful for his leadership, not only at the Department of Energy, but in the entire administration.
Yeah, and I think, if you listen to the podcast we did on November 11th, he talks a lot about Trump, obviously, and he just says, like, this is a man who gets This is a real estate man, but he gets energy. And obviously, he had talked with him, and he knows this. And so, and I do trust Chris Wright. Like I've known him for a long time. But like, I mean, so I know he's working to educate this. I know he cares about this stuff. He's deeply passionate about it, and he gets it. And he cares about the people who are losing, can't pay their electricity bills. But so I think it's that underline, highlight, focus on enough of these are really huge. And so if we can get to the point in the administration where they're starting to talk about, I'm waiting for the day that we start hearing about utility companies, because utility companies are regulated. I'm waiting for the day we start okay, we're not going to build this wind and solar, but we have to deal with the power purchase agreements. We have to deal with the utility companies that are not talking about affordable, reliable. They're still talking about clean and green and have their pay tied to ESG metrics. And so those are huge things that we have to start working around as a country. Like we have to deal with this. And I mean, today I'm talking about natural gas, I'm talking about oil, and I'm just reminding folks that oil, you feel that, right? The administration is honest about, hey, we want lower prices because we want it for the consumer, and the consumer is is all the voters in America and all the people who live here. Well, we have an amazing oil production base of 13.6 million barrels per day as of June. Like we hit another record, 13.6 million barrels a day. Just like context, folks, Russia's producing maybe a little over 10 million barrels a day, and Saudi is not even maybe right now producing maybe 10 million barrels a day. So we're 3.6 million barrels a day over the next largest producer.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Just amazing. So all those, and so every barrel we produce is it's enhancing not just our energy security, but global energy security, because it gives us flexibility and maneuverability. And so I think it's really important, and why I do want the administration to have a better relationship with the industry is that it's like, hey, okay, what do you need to make this work, right? We want lower prices. We want to make this right. But I say this because oil, that when the price goes up, the consumer feels it. When the price goes down, the consumer feels it. And we don't have that with natural gas. We have the utility companies sticking it to the consumer, and so we have tons of natural gas. Yeah. So if we could start getting that cost savings into the consumer, that's a huge economic benefit, not just to everyone, and the consumer, but to businesses and industry.
Yeah, gosh, we've got so much to talk about. We're going to wrap up here in just a minute, but EPA just had a court ruling this week. They can claw back billions of dollars in grants to these basically companies that had no business getting grants from the EPA. It was something that was done during the waning days of the Biden administration, giving out billions of dollars, and the EPA doesn't. Are you
talking about the $76 billion in 94 days?
Yeah, some of that was actually
$96 billion.
Yeah, $96 billion in 74 days.
Yeah.
Yes, $96 billion in 74 days. Absolutely absurd. But a federal court ruled this week that the EPA doesn't have to give these organizations that have no qualifications whatsoever. Huge win for taxpayers and transparency there. That's huge. You had 22 or 23 attorneys general around the country send a letter to the EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, led by Attorney General Knudsen out of Montana, because they uncovered that the Environmental Law Institute, this one that runs a climate judiciary project, which is the tainting of judges around the country, 13% of their revenue in 2023 came from EPA grants. It was about 8 or 9% in 2024 came from EPA grants. Still slated to this year receive a significant amount of money from taxpayer dollars from EPA grants. These attorneys general around the country had the fortitude to send a letter saying you need to stop these grants.
It's a vicious circular.
It really is. We're using taxpayer dollars to fund left-wing organizations. Yeah. It's appalling, really, to fund Democrat campaigns. Different topic, but it's all related, and to see that getting scaled back and the better use of our tax dollars is incredible. You mentioned electricity bills, people getting disconnected. BlackRock, the world's largest financial institution, is not buying a stake in, they are buying Minnesota Power. And the part of the agreement in the purchase of this was to put $3.1 million aside to pay off overdue utility bills, because their costs are too high that people can't afford them. They also agreed to invest in more variable weather dependent generation that's just going to lead to higher costs. This is a terrible investment, and BlackRock is doing it. And I know some people are upset with the Trump administration through Treasury, I believe, or through Department of Defense buying under 10% of Intel. They're citing defense reasons. But where have people been over the last 2 decades when you look at these government-backed public pensions that have been buying companies and investing billions of dollars into companies with political agendas in mind, like what BlackRock has done, forcing behaviors? Larry Fink's on record talking about how they're forcing behaviors at BlackRock. It should be appalling. It should be alarmist. I'm surprised that regulators have approved this sale, but it is going through to BlackRock will completely own Minnesota Power with commitments to essentially increase the cost of utilities. They're going to pass it on to consumers, and they're going to be the ones that are left behind. It's absolutely unfortunate.
I think it's Excel that's actually had pushback because they raised utility prices so much in Minnesota or amazing beats Michigan. They're in the Midwest, and they basically finally had pushback because they've raised the rate so much. And Excel is an amazing offender because they raise the rates of electricity and they pay for all these renewables. They raise the rates of natural gas massively, and so you're finally starting to hear people talk about that, the disconnect in what you pay for natural gas from the utility provider versus what natural gas prices are. But this comment on Intel, and I say this like, again, even if you disagree with politics or whatever it is, there's something awesome happening on energy, and you have to have a change in this tone because you're getting a change in the nature of energy where people are finally getting more comfortable realizing, okay, wind and solar is crap. It doesn't work really well, and maybe we should stop investing in it. Yes, you should absolutely stop investing in it, but also it's realizing like the oil companies stop investing in it, and they're getting comfortable like, okay, let's not invest in that stuff. Let's focus on what we do. And so it's really important because you do have we're at $63 and change today. We should be at a much higher oil price given all the geopolitical angst around the world and the hot wars. But that being said, you can't afford to waste your money on. I mean, if you're a major oil company, you can't afford to be wasting your money on renewables that are not going to pay out. But you're coming about the market like Intel and this criticism. And I think just to put in perspective what it is, like the Biden administration gave Intel money, like gave them. There was strings attached. And the trouble was they wanted to do all this Chips and Science Act, right? They're giving all this money out. And so everybody's kind of woken up to the China threat and realizing, that Biden had a big fence, small yard, or high fence, small yard, or whatever, and all kinds of ridiculous stuff. And Gina Raimondo would be like, well, we can buy the lipstick, but, maybe not chips. And it's like, okay, just get real, right? You're dealing with a problem. And so maybe we should reduce all of our consumption or our stuff from China. And the Trump administration has sort of just been doing it, not talking about it as much. But when it comes to like Intel, basically they were, and there's some issues with the CEO. He does have ties to China, and so that could be an issue in the future. But essentially, Trump says he comes to my office, and he was worried about his job, and I got a stake in the company. Well, the people of America need to realize we'd already given them they were getting this money. It was free. There was a grant, but the Biden administration attached a bunch of, I believe it was a bunch of DEI stuff to it, right? They had to give daycare and all kinds of stuff. And so they were actually having trouble and apparently this happened with a lot of Chips money that they gave was that all the strings attached to it were very onerous.
Oh, that's incredible.
And so it's like daycare, all kinds of stuff. So I believe a lot of that had to do with DEI. So then we just say, okay, we're going to get a stake in this. And then when I believe it was Lutnick, Howard Lutnick, that was interviewed on CNBC, they asked him point blank, so can we think of, is the U.S. going to be doing more of this? And maybe it was Lutnick and some others I think have talked about this as well. Is the U.S. going to be taking bigger stakes in companies? Well, we just took the stake in MP Minerals, right? Which long overdue, but I think China still has a stake, and we need to get that out. We only have one basically, mineral company, rare earth mineral company. So the reason they're doing this is essentially it's sort of like when a government contractor for shipbuilding, right? You've got to give these companies that who's all going to buy a ship? I don't know, maybe the government. Well, you need to give them the security to actually build it, right? And so the contracts have to be longer term, and we've struggled with that because sometimes it gets political and then a short cycle. Well, that's why federal contracts, if they're longer in nature, these guys can build it. And the same thing said of okay, if I'm taking a stake in a company, it's that we want to be able to have some of this in the U.S. because we cannot have to, and I don't think it's bad to have Taiwan, but the exposure of only Taiwan is the problem, right? And so you want to have diversification. But a 10% stake in a company, no. The Trump administration made it very clear they're not going to be it's not a board seat. They're not going to be like, hey, you need to be doing this. It's just saying we're getting something. Now, what exactly the taxpayer benefits from it, I don't know. But it's historically speaking, everyone's freaking out about this. I mean, Obama, we bailed out, GM, we bailed all the auto manufacturers or all the auto companies. And so I'm not saying I wasn't necessarily a fan of that, but this is a little different. It's basically just saying we were going to give you this money. Now we have a stake in the company. But they have been very honest about, hey, we're going to think about more of this, think of more sovereign stuff. And I think if you think about a little bit more from a contract standpoint of what do I need to do to increase the defense industrial base? Well, it takes me 12 years to build a ship. We built the USS Midway, which I was on in San Diego. We built that in a year. We built it in 12 months in 1944 into 1945, and we used it for many, many years. So we could do that in 12 months. We've got to get better about
Incredible.
actually building stuff in America. And there's an attempt. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we got to start somewhere. We got to try something. And what we've done for the past couple decades has not worked.
We need to reindustrialize this country, build things faster, like nuclear energy. We need to get more of that to market. Everybody's saying it's going to be 10 years now before we get new nuclear power on the grid. Nuclear does other things besides power, but yes, we need that. You get regulations out of the way. I'm excited about the direction our country is headed. There's clearly some opportunities ahead. So we shall see. But I think we need to wrap it there.
So can I,
please,
before I
close.
Okay, so today I've been in D.C. and taking meetings, and so we're going to be dropping this paper, but I was paid by the Peterson Foundation, so they commissioned this paper to do, and this is just a thought piece. This is like, could we grow 3 million barrel of oil equivalent per day? And I'm excited to talk about this because I haven't got to talk about this. So it was like, can we grow, just for the question, because Scott Bessett put it out there, the 333.
Yeah.
And it was like, so thought-provoking, like, can we grow 3 million barrel of oil equivalent? And the answer is you absolutely can. And so I did this forecast paper and just thought exercise of doing this. And what's been awesome is meeting with people all day today, of like talking about this, of just like, how do you do it? What do you do? What are the movers? What are the drivers? And I'm always impressed when people ask really good questions of like, how does this actually work? And so it makes me excited that, like, one, we can do it, we can grow the production, and two, people actually care about it, and that three, it's a massive, that 13.6 million barrels a day of production is a huge, that is an industrial sector of the economy. Like, that's a huge component of our economy, and it's something we shouldn't take lightly. We need to keep it going, we need to keep growing it, and we need to be proud of it.
Awesome. As Chris Wright says, energy isn't part of the economy. It is the economy.
Energy's
it's the heart
everything.
Of it is. It absolutely is everything. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Again, I'm Jason Isaac. I live a high carbon lifestyle. I'm working so that the rest of the world can too. I'm the CEO of the American Energy Institute. Thanks for joining the High Carbon Lifestyle podcast and the
PetroNerds podcast. Trisha Curtis, CEO of PetroNerds. Thank you guys so much for listening.